Good afternoon and welcome to the D.G. Murray Trust's perspectives on escaping the inequality trap. My name is David Harrison. I'm the CEO of the D.G. Murray Trust. And we need to start by apologizing for starting 15 minutes later than we had scheduled. We fell victim to the severe rolling blackouts that South Africa faces as a consequence of our electricity crisis, which is an interference and an irritation for us today, but has got much larger social and economic ramifications for the country. And so it is against that backdrop that we confront the context of inequality in South Africa and what's driving it. I'm very pleased this afternoon to be able to present and to moderate this live stream, and thank you to all of you for having joined. We will keep it to 45 minutes as some of our speakers have to go. Earlier this month, we heard the president talk about hope during his State of the Nation address, saying that we are a nation defined by hope and resilience. Yes, hope is important, but in the face of corruption and indifference, let's be frank, the emotion of hope can take a beating. South Africa's inequality trap, today's topic of conversation, is not only a structural one, but an attitudinal one as well. Our ability to imagine a different future and to make it happen tends to be stifled by layers of entitlement and social inequality, justifications for inaction, and denials of responsibility. Faced by this reality, and if the past shapes the future, it's easy to become anxious and to lose hope. But as the Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch argued, hope cannot simply be an emotion, but a practice. And we have to practice hope through our actions. In his words, the work of the emotion of hope requires people who throw themselves actively into what is becoming to which they themselves belong. Being part of its realization is what creates hope. And that's why we can't keep tracing the same old pathways to development in South Africa. We need bold and decisive twists that get us out of the rut, give fresh perspective, and create new opportunities. So fresh perspective is precisely why we are here today. So let's start today's conversation by welcoming the panelists and everybody who's watching this live stream on LinkedIn this afternoon. My guests are Haroon Borat, who's Professor of Economics and Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, Kate Phillip, who's Project Lead for the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program, and Lebo Ramafoko, who's Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa. In South Africa, the gap between the rich and the poor is so wide that too few people are able to build the knowledge and skills to fully participate in the society and the economy. Those excluded have worse nutrition, poor education, poorer health, limiting their potential to nurture their children and contribute to the economy as they grow up. And so in the poorest 20% of households, we see these intergenerational cycles of exclusion, stuck in an inequality trap with few chances to escape. How did we get here? What are the pathways to escape? This is our simple framing and the basis on which a lot of DG&T's work is based. But I'd like to now turn to our panelists and delve a little bit deeper into how we escape this vortex. How do we find our way out, inspire ourselves, act in ways that are going to get us out of the inequality trap? And so turning first to you, Haroon, if I may, you and your colleagues have characterized the problem by saying that South Africa has been in a long-run, low-growth trap since 1994, with modest reductions in household poverty levels, coupled with high and rising inequality. if that's the characterization, could you give us a sense of the scale of the problem? What is the size? What does this mean in numbers?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks to everybody who's dialed in. I mean, I think so. So when one looks at the data and you take a sample of middle-income countries, so let's exclude low-income countries and high-income countries, and you just look at economies that look similar to South Africa's, and you take a 40-year period, so 1980 to the present, or indeed even post-94, if you like, you will generally find that South Africa sits in terms of growth in GDP per capita levels at the bottom of that sample. So a specific data point over the period 1980 to, I think it was 2018 that we have the data for, every year annually. So if you take real GDP growth per capita on an annualized basis from 1980 to 2018, South Africa grew at 0.29%. So for 40 years, every year South Africa grows at 0.29%. How bad is that? So let's take the top of the class, which I'm sure you can guess is China. China grew at 8%, actually 8.2% per year, every year for 40 years. So that's the scale of the gap. If I could share with you the graphic, you'll see that sitting at the bottom of the class right next to us is firstly Ukraine and then Venezuela. So we're in the bottom three of that sample that we have data for. If you think, okay, I'm looking at China, pick a country that's an emerging market: Turkey, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, India. They've all grown at up to 4 times as fast as South Africa. So the key point, David, really is that, you know, economists disagree on many things, but one of the things we tend to agree on is that one way, the closest thing to a magic bullet to reducing poverty levels, and given a particular type of growth, also inequality levels in a society, is to have persistently high levels of economic growth. And we just haven't had that. The nature of our growth trajectory, as well as the level, has been of such a character that we've seen modest reductions in poverty. So let's be clear, there have been reductions given in-country poverty lines, in poverty levels, sort of 3-4% depending on the time period, but inequality has either risen depending on the time period or the nature of inequality you're measuring, you know, the source of income, or it's stayed the same. And so effectively, low levels of economic growth of the wrong type, and we can talk about what type of economic growth you need, has resulted in no movement in inequality and very marginal declines in poverty levels.
Kate, the 40-year time span is a little interesting for me, because I first encountered you when I was entering university just about 40 years ago, and you were a fantastic student leader at the time. So you've kept your feet firmly on the ground. You've been an observer and an activist involved in this process over 40 years. I mean, can you give us a sense of why are we so stuck? Why are we not seeing the economic growth that would be required to drive the economy and over time reduce poverty and inequality levels?
So there are many, many factors, but people do talk about the structural challenges that we face, and that is a whole discussion on its own. But in the context of the inequality discussion, I just want to pick up on a couple of the structural factors that are unique to South Africa. I think the first issue is the issue of land dispossession. That's the original sin in terms of inequality, and also our very deep levels of spatial inequality, which are part of the mix. And one of the things that has resulted in is that people were dispossessed, displaced, and it means that we have a far smaller level of participation in smallholder agriculture than developing economies of a similar size and scale. So that immediately contributes to the scale of our unemployment. And part of the problem is, you might think that, okay, then land redistribution is a silver bullet. Unfortunately, the role of land in capital accumulation is not the same today as it was when it was taken away. And so, yes, the employment effects and the limits of smallholder agriculture are a problem we deal with. And yes, land redistribution is important, but it's not a simple silver bullet. I just want to look at three areas of structural challenge. I think the second one Harun has alluded to, and I won't go into it in depth, for all kinds of reasons. We don't have a particularly highly labor-intensive industrial structure. And so our core economy is not as good at absorbing particularly unskilled labor as other developing countries have been. And in the context of our skills issues, that compounds it. But there's a third element that I think is poorly understood that I really want to focus on, which is the implications of centralization and monopoly ownership in our economy, which was very much a feature of the apartheid years. It has dissipated somewhat, but not a lot. And the nature of that concentration is that all of the core items in the consumption basket of poor people are mass produced in the core economy. Now, in other developing countries, people often say South Africa has a small entrepreneurial sector, a small informal sector, a small level of small enterprise relative to other similar countries. And yes, entrepreneurship was criminalized under apartheid, and that's part of the picture, but it's not the whole story. A really crucial part of the story is that in other countries, the entry point for entrepreneurs is to make and sell things they use themselves and that they know their community needs. In South Africa, most of those items are mass produced in our core economy, and entrepreneurs can't enter at that point. So maize meal, peanut butter, tomato sauce, you name it, all are mass produced in the core economy. And it means that entrepreneurship faces particular hurdles. All of these structural factors impact on employment levels. And we know that employment is the single biggest factor determining income inequality in our economy. So employment is at the core.
Lebo, you've been a civil society activist for a very long time. So looking at it very much from a community perspective, but let's just step back and allow you to characterize this situation as you see it and from your point of view. And just come off mute.
I almost cringed when the president spoke about hope and resilience, because it signified a president for me that had not been on the ground since COVID. Within the first week of COVID, people did not know what they are going to eat. And it is because the people who were going out and relying on the informal economy, could not go out because of restrictions. And right now, their little ways of making money is being eroded by the electricity crisis. There are no boots for people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And therefore, it's very difficult, and I think tone deaf, to be talking about resilience when that is also what people have been demonstrating. There's also high levels of mistrust in the state, mistrust in, a lot of big institutions, mistrust in the economy, mistrust that anybody else is listening. And also, I think a historical analysis of the problem. So even when you have seen others who have, whether they are the opposition parties who want to criticize the ANC, or a whole lot of middle-class South Africans who want to raise the issues, they are basically raised in a very ahistorical manner that really does not take into consideration the history of our country. And just listening to Harun talking about the levels of growth from 1994, you can then realize that this problem did not start right now. But certainly a lot of mistrust from community level and a lot of conspiracy theories of what is happening. But I think the way that the state has responded to a number of crises is that it has created a shrinking civil space. So the amount of engagement, real critical conversations about what are the problems and what are the solutions have really resulted into an us and them. And the only way, as we know, when there were a number of uprisings, and I think the CSVR wrote an article on the smoke that calls, is that communities have known that the only way that they will get a response from the state is if they burn something. And business has also put themselves as if they are the panacea, and even in the corruption, they've got no responsibility to it. It is only, and there are racial undertones, a Black-led government that is corrupt, and they have had nothing to do with it. But I also think that, the inability to deal with what is happening within the ruling party has affected any sense of hope of whether or not there are solutions. And the fact that we are almost like bystanders as citizens watching, firstly, a political party that is the ruling party at war with each other exacerbates the whole issue of mistrust.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those sort of opening statements. And we obviously will try and expand a little bit on them now. Just to invite the LinkedIn users, feel free, if you have a question, to just type them in, and we'll try and direct them to our panelists as we proceed. So a pretty gloomy picture painted, the ball and chain of apartheid still with us, arising from the dispossession of lands so long ago, high levels of unemployment, the economy that is very, very concentrated, very difficult to turn that around. And then on top of that, we've heard of institutional failures, political failures, post-apartheid that have meant that we've not seized the opportunities that came our way. So Haroon, if we to continue on the same path, where are we going to end up?
Yeah, I mean, so David, just to embellish what I said earlier, but also what Lebogang and Kate have added, is that, if you look at, so low growth is one thing, right? But it's also the nature of economic growth that's worrying. So the idea that you have, and I want the listeners to follow me carefully, because I'm going to tell two stories. On the one hand, you've got a structure of growth which is not labor intensive enough. And I think Kate alluded to that. So the patterns of growth in most fast growing, successful East Asian economies, where everyone from Taiwan, or you can go back to Japan, right through to Vietnam, is built on low wage manufacturing, right? So the idea that you, or labor intensive manufacturing, let's keep it neutral. The idea that you create large numbers of jobs through exportables that are cheap manufacturing goods, right? We are not on that path. We are on a high-skilled, services-orientated growth trajectory, incidentally, with the footnote being that a third of all jobs since 94 have been created in the public sector. So there's this worrying growth of public sector employment, but most of the employment, 75% of it, has been in services sectors. Some of it is semi-skilled type of jobs, BPOs and so on, but the vast majority sits in the public sector or frankly in low productivity jobs outside of manufacturing or in high skilled jobs. So we've got the wrong structure of growth for the nature of the supply side problem, which is unemployment. So I think that's a key part of reconfiguring our growth trajectory. Not only must it be higher, but the nature of growth must be more labor intensive. But here's the second story, David, that is fundamentally important. And I wish we had a poll that we could ask the listeners to respond, right? If you take the average middle income country, so that sample I mentioned, excluding South Africa, and you said for every 100 people, how many are in wage employment? So think formal sector job, how many in the informal sector, and how many in unemployment? So three numbers. For 100 people in the average emerging markets, it's 45, 45, 10. So 45 people in formal employment, wage employment, 45 in the informal sector, and 10 in unemployment. Now, I would ask the poll, if we had a poll to say, okay, what does the listeners say about South Africa? What's that ratio, right? And here's the thing. The first number, and everybody gets it wrong, the first number in South Africa, remember in emerging markets, it's 45. In South Africa, David, it's 50. 50. So we actually have very large numbers of people in wage employment relative to the average emerging market. But here's the second story. What's the second number? The informally employed in South Africa is not 45, right? It's 16. And then the last number is 34. So actually, the real story, David, just to eat up some of the time, is that levels of growth are particularly low, but other emerging markets close their labor market, as we say, by allowing people entry into the informal sector. Ease of access into and out of the informal sector mops up people into some form of economic activity. We don't do that. We have one of the lowest rates of informality in the developing world or in the middle income country world relative to our unemployment rate. So that if you like, the ratios are very clear. You're not going to create a sufficiently large number of formal sector wage jobs. That's really important, manufacturing, labor-intensive growth, and so on. But the informal sector, self-employment must be a feature of that. And we could start the conversation about where that needs to go, but I think we've missed a trick, actually. And just a lead in, our problem starts with regulators. What is the regulator's view? Keep them, it's always a them, out of the cities. Keep them away, confiscate goods, formalize. It's the wrong model. But let me stop there.
Thanks, Haroon. And if I wouldn't mind just, if you wouldn't mind just answering a quick question from Geordie, who said, do you agree with Kate that land dispossession was the original sin?
Yes, I saw that. I thought I'd detour that question because Kate mentioned it. So I'm not a land reform expert. Historically, it must be the original sin, right? Because if you just look at the economics of, say, Taiwan, Japan is the same. Most East Asian success stories were built on smallholder agriculture. And out of that came a peasant class and so on. And there you got sort of the gradual process. So we've completely upended that through the process of dispossession. And so the natural process of economic development has broken down. But I'm not a land reform and land expert, so I speak under correction, but that's my instinct. Yeah.
And Lebo, a quick response from you?
Absolutely. Land, particularly in Africa, has more than just economic benefits. The displacement that we see of people who have really been disconnected from ownership, from belonging, cannot be counted in rands and cents. If you look at the history of people being uprooted from where they stay, whether you look at District 6 in Cape Town, whether you look at other neighboring countries where many men had to leave to come and work in the mines, you look what that dispossession from a psychological, cultural, anthropological level has done to people. It has done untold damage to a people. So it is the original sin.
Great, thank you very much. And you know, I think we've focused quite a lot on the structure of the economy and economic responses, and you know, just looking at the comments that are starting to come in and the questions that are starting to come in. People are anxious to know if there's any hope, if there's any way out of it. And Haroon, you started to describe the changes that could fairly easily be achieved, surely, in overcoming some of the red tape preventing people from from operating in the informal market. Kate, but if we can come to you and if you could just give a sense of what do you see as the main escape routes, the sort of the main frontiers that we need to be driving hard to get us out of this cycle of inequality, and if you could focus not only on the economic side but also on the human side as well, the human development side. What do you see as the sort of key components that lead to employability and consequently productivity that ultimately will drive that economic growth?
So before we get to the hopeful bit, I want to really...
I'm having difficulty keeping out of this vortex, but let's keep sinking, Kate.
No. I just want to highlight that Harun's ratios are so interesting because they completely confirm the structural issues I was highlighting. Because in other countries, that informal component includes smallholder farmers. And smallholder farmers are a big part of that informal percentage that we lack. So, you know, our land, the history of our land issues has sabotaged, if you like, the absorptive capacity of land-based livelihoods in our economy. And there is no easy solution to that because it's been lost intergenerationally. It is not easy to take urbanized people, unemployed people now and put them back on the land. So, you know, there's no quick fix there. The other thing is the informal sector and the role of the structure of the economy and how difficult it is for entrepreneurs. And so often the debate about entrepreneurship is about the capacities of entrepreneurs, and I don't entirely agree with that. I think we're perfectly entrepreneurial. And the red tape stuff, I agree, we can do better. But I think often that misses how the centralization in the core economy blocks opportunities, entry points into economic activity, making things like sunflower oil, peanut butter, even bread, maize meal on a small scale. It simply isn't viable. You have to find other niches that are not occupied by the giants, and it makes it harder for entrants. So where do we go and how do we solve it? No easy answers, but yes, we do have to build the small enterprise and entrepreneurial sector. We do have to build the informal sector. We do have to take seriously the entry. We have to provide more access to not just credit, but also capital. There are all kinds of things we need to do. But what I'm also going to argue is that we also need a circuit breaker. We need a circuit breaker because we're so locked in these patterns. And no matter how well we do at nurturing entrepreneurship, it's not going to happen overnight. And we can't continue as we are. And that's why I'm afraid, and I will be a stuck record on this, we need to reimagine public employment, not as public sector employment, but public employment as a circuit breaker, as a mechanism that can get people working, because at our level of unemployment, it has systemically negative impacts on net productivity in our whole economy. All the evidence shows that long-term unemployment erodes productivity. We have that at a systemic level. We have to get the habits of work, the habits of working, the benefits of working back into the culture of communities. One of our straplines is there's no shortage of work to be done at community level, and ain't that the truth? I mean, part of, and this is about using public employment as a circuit breaker. So many of the social problems at a local level, the human development problems, are functions of poverty and inequality. And there is work to be done in addressing them. And so we need to think in a different way about how we deploy public employment as a redistributive instrument, addressing spatial inequality, addressing economic marginalization, addressing human development needs. Do that in partnership with the anti-poverty interventions like the SRD grant, because poverty is what is reproducing inequality of human development. So yes, we must, even though the SRD doesn't particularly reduce income inequality, it can reduce inequality at the level of human development. So we need these instruments working in tandem. We need that because also we need money in poor communities to stimulate the informal sector. Entrepreneurs again and again say one of their biggest problems is no market. People are poor, they don't have money to pay. We have to use circuit breakers that are redistributive, that can kickstart economic activity at that local level to achieve what Harun is talking about and to get the country working again. Thank you.
Wongi, Merle, I trust your questions are being addressed through the answers that Kate has given. Kate, can I just push you a little bit more just for people who are not familiar with the term social employment, and how does that potentially break the intergenerational cycle? Could you give us some examples of social employment at a community level?
So we used the presidential employment stimulus to experiment with this model, which we called social employment. And as we have coined the term, it is about supporting community-driven processes of addressing local problems to create employment. So as a circuit breaker. So social employment, there is a social employment fund There has been a process. There are 28 strategic implementing partners. It currently employs 50,000 people. It can expand exponentially. In the very first call for proposals, those that met the minimum qualifying criteria were already 300,000. So we can significantly expand support to forms of work that support local solutions to local problems, in the process supporting existing organizations that are already doing that in all kinds of ways. So it's gender-based violence, it's food security, it's early childhood development, it's informal settlement upgrading, it's public art, it's you name it. As long as it fits, as long as it can be defined as work for the common good that is delivered through non-state actors, which is also a key part of the component, and is part of building capacity at the local level to create employment to address local problems. That's how we've defined it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Before I come to you, Haroon, Carlelo asks an interesting question. In the sort of the spectrum of community activities, what is the place or the role of indigenous systems? Is there any way of bringing in the local knowledge? Or is it a sort of fairly top-down approach?
Is that for me?
Yes, please.
The whole point about the concept is that what it must do is serve the common good. It must be work for the common good. It must be work. So it's about employing people to work to deliver outcomes that serve the common good. So as long as whatever it is, indigenous knowledge systems certainly fit within that category as far as I would be concerned. But whatever it is, there must be an employment component and a public benefit component, a common good contribution. Those are the magic elements.
Thank you. Haroon?
Yeah, so more, I guess, a complementary point, but I think I'll sort of probably say it more jarringly than it needs to be said, but I think Kate knows me well enough to know where it's coming from, so I can just state it, is that there are limits to what the public sector can do as good and as positive as the public employment schemes have been. And they've been massively positive, and Kate knows this. We've dealt with this for many years. And so you ask the question, what, if you had the reduced capacity of the state, if you had reduced revenues, what do other states do? And I've called it, if you go back into the awful sort of Reagan right-wing years, they called it supply-side economics. But you almost can turn it on its head and call it supply-side economics of a good type. And what that means is to find ways to unlock what Kate calls entrepreneurship, what I call firms. So when and firms don't mean listed entities on the JSE only. Somebody selling by the roadside Millie's is a firm. It's an enterprise. But if she is forced away by the police officers or has no storage facilities at the end of the day, or is the victim of crime because the police officers are either complicit in the crime or in fact not doing their job, then you've got a whole range of what I would call constraints on the operation of a business. That's what it is. And so the idea is that supply side initiatives where we think of tax incentives and so on also apply to the informal sector. So you have to find ways to give people access to market, storage facilities. Don't let them, I've gone on and on about this in public, about license fees. It's the most ludicrous thing that you can think of, that if you're in the informal sector, you have to pay 1,200 Rand a year to set up a business in a 30% unemployment society. It's absolutely, but the idea is you have to unlock growth of firms. And firms are across the range, from survivalist enterprises right through to listed entities. And the kinds of supply-side initiatives are different. The informal sector worker in Cape Town, she needs storage facilities. Right next to her is a formal large entity that may need access to a port, and the port needs to function more effectively. Both are equally important, but I think in the way that policy has gone, we've treated focus on firms at the top end. For formal large firms, we've done probably badly, but we've tried there. And the focus on the poor has been through households. But there are fiscal limits to that, right? Whether it's social grants, child support grant, we've done really well, actually, but we've underperformed in terms of firms, what I would call enterprises, right? Informal firms, small businesses. And I think the range of policy support you need there is absolutely critical, and it's underdeveloped. And we have almost the wrong mental model in terms of how to pursue economic development. And the data shows that, right? The fact that you only got 16 people out of 100 in the informal sector compared to 45 in the rest of the developing world tells you the gap in terms of policy changes.
But I can quickly come in just to say that I completely agree with Harun, but these things are completely synergistic because you need to do both together. They need to work in synergy. And public employment is, I often say it's plan B. It's not only plan B, it has plan A components, but plan A is get all these other, get the economy doing what the economy needs to do. But when that's not happening, society needs a plan B. And that's where we are.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Anthony, I see that your question has been asked but answered in terms of the enabling environment for informal work and how do we really create a flourishing space for firms to come. Lebo, I'm going to bring you in here because we've been focusing a lot on the interface between government and private sector and really, I guess, illustrating almost this very sort of bipolar nature of firms in South Africa, the bigger corporations, the formal and the smaller firms that are struggling to get a foothold. But let's talk a little bit about another critical sector in society, civil society in its various forms, and the type of role that it can play in terms of helping to get us out of the inequality trap. And both of us have spent time in what are called philanthropic ventures. I like to see them as more strategic investors in developing South Africa's potential. This is not about charity, but it would be very useful to just get a sense from you about what you see as the role of non-profit strategic investors, philanthropists in trying to change the trajectories we're speaking about. We heard from Harun that we can't rely on the public sector to be the sole driver of change. It's the sort of pressure. These boosters have to come from a variety of spaces. Lebo, over to you.
So the not-for-profit sector or the NGO sector has become two things in the current state. One of them is that they also offer a lot of employment, and their employment is also accompanied by a lot of training. The kind of activism that we have seen that came out of organizations like Section 27 and others means that there is a lot of work that happens at a community level. They also are the most in touch with the realities of what is happening on the ground. And it's unfortunate that a lot of funders have not given as much resources in research and evaluation to write up, I think, what for me, from the Love Lives to the Soul Cities to so many other organizations, even Sangoko earlier on actually writing about what does it mean to have an engaged society and an engaged citizenry. And we have seen that the NGO sector has done that. I think one of the things that we are seeing, and that is the sad part, is that that is also changing, because the world of money and the world of funding often dictates what are some of the focus areas. So the same way that we are saying the informal economy is not growing, a lot of very good on the ground NGOs continue to close. And we have seen that a lot with COVID, because at a whim, the priorities of the funder basically changes. And in fact, in a lot of ways, what you are saying is that while charity is important, because even during COVID, you saw people coming in, feeding and putting, like putting up soup kitchens, etc., which was very, very important, and it continues to be important. You can't pontificate while people are going to bed hungry. What is important is that the philanthropy world has a role to play in social justice, in questioning the social structure of the economy, of politics, and supporting those that are excluded. So if you are going to take the struggle for treatment in South Africa, the support that organizations like Section 27 got enabled the women in Khayelitsha to tell their stories and to be center stage into what a very complex scientific, can we afford the drugs, do these drugs work, basically say nothing about us without us, and they were center stage in advocating for that. And more of money that comes from philanthropy wants to do service level work. They want to be giving people money, sometimes for programs that were not even conceptualized and co-created with communities. So we also need to be calling not only NGOs to account, but also funders of NGOs, philanthropies, to be saying who is being excluded. What are some of the programs that are suffering as a result of the inept of the world? But we must also be very conscious of the growth globally of far right-wing politics that are happening, and where you find a lot of money going into what is now the anti-gender movement and supporting, movements that are actually eroding some of the gains that have happened in areas like sexual and reproductive health and rights, sexual justice, etc., etc. So there is also, while we want to keep and we want NGOs to keep governments accountable, we also need to have our eyes open around where is other money coming from and what it is supporting. But I also want to say a small point about social employment, which is very, very important for me because it aligns with my feminist principles. A lot of work that is happening is care work. It is done mainly by women and it is not compensated. Social employment is not only about dealing with unemployment and putting money, it's also redressing a sector that has basically been ignored, and that is care work that is absolutely not compensated, and that women, particularly Black women, are doing for free and are expected to do for free. So social employment, for that case, it's also a social justice issue.
Thanks, Lebo. We're fast running out of time. And so there are quite a few questions that have come in, but pretty much along the same line, everybody striving to know, what are the biggest things that need to be done? What can be done differently? What are the twists that will get us on a different trajectory? And so, Haroon, let me ask you, if you had the power to lift one structural barrier, to change one structural thing in South Africa that you think would have the biggest effect, understanding that this is long-term and understanding the complexity, where would you put your effort?
So I think the effort has to be in, as you'd expect me to say, the informal sector, and go through methodically those micro barriers, everything from license fees to local government regulation that prevents the operation of the informal sector, lack of storage facilities, crime, all of that can be fixed. The one that I think is particularly difficult is the spatial separation, if you like, which separates the informal sector from urban consumers that are high income or higher income. So if you go to an average township, you will find what looks like a developing country set up in terms of a hive of informal sector activity. My point is that needs to move into cities, and that needs to move to where consumers are. It's a very different reconfiguration of our cities. And for me, that's the closest thing to the magic bullet. I will tell listeners, if I drop off, as you know, David, it's not because of them, it's just because I have a 3 o'clock. So
thank you. And I think the point you're making is, Haroon, is that that sort of enabling environment is something within our control. It's something that we can make a lot more progress than we are already. Kate, I'd like to come to you just finally, just to wrap up. I mean, we've heard about government, private sector, civil society. I mean, clearly we have to harness the full expertise in this country. We've got to put our heads together. We have to synergize. Any concluding thoughts from you about how we do that better than we have in the past? Kate, you're on mute.
Sorry. We need to get much better at partnership. We talk social compacts and we talk partnership, and we're not very good at actually getting our hands dirty at doing things in collaborative ways where each of the parties is actually bringing something to the table rather than haranguing the other party, as it were. The problem is that there are very different perspectives on what needs to be done. I do think, to pick up on Harun's points, I do think that the private sector has a crucial role to play in enabling access to new markets for small enterprises, and for not seeing the informal sector as a problem. I think more could be done at that level. And also, when you talk the private sector, it's the financial sector, and issues of access to credit, access to capital, new models for support. We know that startup businesses can't be funded on loans alone. No business expects to be viable on that basis. And when we're talking about inequality, we're talking about communities without capital to draw on. So we need different financing instruments. We have one of the most creative financial sectors in the world. We need that firepower and that creative power addressing these micro level solutions also. I'll leave it there.
So we started off with really the sort of this legacy that holds us back in South Africa, understanding no quick fixes, that this is about breaking intergenerational cycles. It is long term. On the other hand, and this is so much consistent with complex systems theory of if you're going to change long-term trajectories, you've got to effect change now. You got to change those initial conditions, otherwise we'll end up on the same trajectory. And so I think we've started to talk about some of those initial conditions that need to change, that we can step back and say, while we still have many problems, we can say with confidence that our country is on a radically different trajectory than in the past. We've heard that it requires economic changes. We've heard that it requires political commitment and accountability. And we've heard that it requires programs appropriate for human development in this country, and finding ways to bring those together. Let's not forget that today, even as we speak, 2,600 babies are born in South Africa. What we do over the next 5 years, whether they will get nutrition, whether they'll get early learning, early language development, the schools they go to, will all influence their employability, will all influence their productivity, the type of economic system that they will go into. And so for that reason, it's absolutely critical that we focus as much on developing their human potential for 20 years' time, even as we're focusing on the employment crisis that we have today. In 20 years' time, we want to look back and say the children born today were on a fundamentally different trajectory than their parents and grandparents. Thank you so much to the panelists for condensing so much wisdom into such a short period of time. Once again, I'm sorry we had to start early, but certainly a huge amount of food for thought. And let us all jump right in, as Ernst Bloch said, as passionate activists to bring about the change that we want to be part of. Thank you and goodbye.